welcome to you as well. I was told that I had to just remember them in the crypt. Now, as Philip has said, we're in a series, we're looking at big issues that are in the Old Testament and mirrored in the New Testament. And we looked at the first week at the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Gethsemane, the Garden in Heaven. And Rob very helpfully explained the unfolding revelation of God throughout the scriptures, Old and New. And then last week we had Dave on the temple, how in the Old Testament it was a building in which God's presence came and that he made his presence known to the people in a building. And then amazingly in the New Testament we discovered that we are the temple of the Holy Spirit. We are the place where God dwells, where his presence is. Absolutely incredible. Tonight we're looking at the big theme of wilderness. When you think about it, and I did, and you'll have your own thoughts about it, there are so many references in the Bible about wilderness. You go right back to Moses, and there he is, it says, in the backside of the desert. He's in the wilderness, he's lonely, looking after his sheep, and he has this amazing encounter with God at the burning bush. And then you get Jacob wrestling with God in the wilderness. And he says to God, I'm not leaving this place until you bless me. And then David, fleeing from the murderous intent of Saul. And he's there in this lonely, frightening place. And he finds En-Gedi, this oasis in the wilderness. And then we think about Ezekiel. And he sees this valley, this wilderness of dry bones. And God says to him, breathe on them. And he breathes on these dry bones and they become an army there in the midst of barrenness and dryness. And then one of my favorites, I think, in the Song of Solomon, where it talks about the bride. And it says this, it says, she is coming out of the wilderness. And what is she doing? She's leaning on her lover. She has been in that hard place. She has seen Jesus there. And here she is coming out, leaning on her Lord. And then we get in the minor prophet Hosea, this man with an unfaithful wife. And it says there that the Lord will lead her tenderly into the wilderness of Achor, the wilderness, and he will make it a door of hope. Now, do you notice in all those things that I've cited, the wilderness is a terrible, hard, and dreadful place. But it always ends in blessing. And then if we come into the New Testament, we find there Paul. He has had this amazing experience of seeing Jesus, and he's had this dramatic conversion. And you would think that he would go immediately spreading it all everywhere. He doesn't. He goes for 3 years into the desert of Arabia, it says, so that he can, establish this relationship with this God that he's just discovered. He can know him, know what his mind is for him, and then he can go out and do the business for God. They're all places that end in blessing. Now, the two wildernesses that I've been given to speak on tonight are firstly, the wilderness journey of the children of Israel coming out from Egypt 40 years in the desert. And secondly, in the New Testament, Jesus in the wilderness being tempted of the devil. And I think we will see some similarities in these two events, looking at the children of Israel coming from the triumph of the Red Sea into the wilderness, and Jesus coming from the triumph of Jordan into the desert of temptation. And the wilderness, I wonder what comes into your mind when you think of that word wilderness. It's a barren, it's a desolate place. There's no rain there, there's extreme temperature, and there's very sparse vegetation. It's empty and it's a forsaken place. It's a lonely place, and it has spiritual parallels that speak of dry and fruitless periods in our experience. You have experienced that, I know. They're painful, and they're hard to bear. And it's times for us when peace and joy is absent, and enthusiasm in our lives for the things of God is a long-lost friend. And there will be people here tonight who have experienced wilderness times in their life, and there will be some who this very moment are in the midst of it, in the midst of a wilderness experience. But the truth about the desert is this, that God may lead you into the wilderness, but God will lead you out. We will all walk there at some time in our life, every one of us, I think. But you know what? We will be made stronger for it. We will be hungry there. We will be tempted there. We will have all of our pride and our self-focus stripped away from us. But we will come out of the wilderness as transformed people. And there is immense value in the wilderness, even though it is such a hard place. And tonight we're not looking at how we can avoid these times, avoid these experiences, but how they can shape and change us. You know, the place of hurt and barrenness can become for us the place of preparation that leads us into the things that God always intended us to do and to be. I was trying to rack my brains. I think there's a book written by Mike Pilavachi called The Wilderness, is it? Does anybody know that? Yeah, good. But I know this about that book because I heard him say it once. He said that he would have never exchanged that wilderness time in his life for anything because he learned things from God there that he could have never learned anywhere else. And in this passage that we read, we haven't read it, have we? Let's read our passage. Deuteronomy 8, 1-6 in the NIV. Be careful to follow every command I am giving you today, so that you may live and increase and may enter and possess the land that the Lord promised on oath to your ancestors. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Know then in your heart that as a man disciples his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you. Observe the commands of the Lord your God, walking in obedience to him and revering him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with brooks and streams and deep springs gushing out into the valleys and hills, a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil and honey, a land where bread will not be scarce and you will lack nothing, a land where the rocks are iron and you can dig copper out of the hills. Marvellous passage, marvellous promises there. And in this passage, Moses is taking this people on a trip down memory lane. And he's reminding them of the wilderness journey that they have just for the past 40 years been on. And he's telling them about the valuable lessons that he's learned. But it's not a sentimental journey. It's a preparation for them now to cross out of the wilderness into the promised land. It's instructive. And Moses says, remember how the Lord led you all the way in the wilderness. The first thing, the Lord led you. It was not merely chance, but he was overseeing your journey. And the central issue is, how did God lead them in this wilderness time? It was a strange mixture of difficulty and then divine intervention. It was hunger and provision. It was a dry and a dusty place. It was not a tropical paradise. There was not an abundance of food there, and it was very hard to find water. But verse 15 says, God led them through the vast and dreadful desert, that thirsty and waterless land with its snakes and scorpions. And we say, why on earth didn't God remove all the difficulties for them? Why doesn't he do that for us in our lives when we're going through wilderness experiences? Verse 2 tells us, the Lord led you all the way to test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep my commands. You know, God wanted to do a deep work of grace in this rebellious people, right down there in their hearts. And the trials were not only designed to show God what was in their hearts, they were designed to show them what was in their hearts. When the pressure mounted in that wilderness, that's when they knew where they were spiritually. And it will be the same for us. It was there that they knew just how much God meant to them and how much they were trusting in him. If you go down to Quick Fit, down on Whiteladies Road, you will see there racks of marvellous tyres. You know, they all look brilliant. They all look wonderful, spanking new, and really good. But you get on the motorway at 70 miles an hour with your car laden up with stuff, and you hit a stone or you go into a pothole. That's when you'll find out what the tyre is really made of. That's the time when that tyre is going to blow out. And the children of Israel learned things about themselves in that wilderness that they would never have learned in a tropical paradise. And neither will we. This life that we're living, this life that we're in, is a training ground for eternity. It's a life that's conforming us to the image of God's Son, Jesus. It's preparing us for blessings that are going to come into our lives, like we read in that passage. Verse 7, he's bringing you into a good land, streams, pools, and you will lack nothing. It seems that you're never going to get out of that wilderness. You will. In chapter, I mentioned in that first section about Hosea's wife, Gomer, that unfaithful wife, and how it said, God says, I'm going to allure her. I'm going to lead her into the wilderness, and I'm going to speak tenderly to her. You think, amazing, God, amazing. I will give her back her vineyards, and I will make the valley of Achor, the wilderness of trouble, I will make it into a door of hope. There she will sing as in her youth. I think that's beautiful. That's God using a wilderness experience to show us what we're really like, tenderly to bring us out. So, we come to the New Testament and Jesus in the wilderness. So can we have our Matthew reading then, please? Matthew 4, 1 to 11, and we're in the Message. Next, Jesus was taken into the wild by the Spirit for the test, and the devil was ready to give it. Jesus prepared for the test by fasting 40 days and 40 nights. That left him, of course, in a state of extreme hunger, which the devil took advantage of in the first test. Since you are God's son, speak the word that will turn these stones into loaves of bread. Jesus answered by quoting Deuteronomy. It takes more than bread to stay alive. It takes a steady stream of words from God's mouth. For the second test, the devil took him to the holy city. He sat him on top of the temple and said, since you are God's son, jump. The devil goaded him by quoting Psalm 91. He has placed you in the care of angels. They will catch you so that you won't so much as stub your toe on a stone. Jesus countered with another citation from Deuteronomy. Don't you dare test the Lord your God. For the third test, the devil took him to the peak of a high mountain. He gestured expansively, pointing out all the earth's kingdoms, how glorious they all were. Then he said, they're yours. Lock, stock, and barrel. Just go down on your knees and worship me, and they're yours. Jesus' refusal was curt. Get out of here, Satan. He backed his rebuke with a third quotation from Deuteronomy. Worship the Lord your God and only him. Serve him with absolute single-heartedness. The test was over. The devil left. And in his place, angels. Angels came and took care of Jesus' needs. We see here one of the most monumental and mysterious spiritual battles. In the wilderness, between good and evil, between light and darkness, between obedience and disobedience, between Jesus and the devil. And for us the same, he wants to tempt us. He wants to come and devour all those that are attempting to please God at any level in their lives. We're in the time of Lent right now. We're thinking about the journey that Jesus took to the cross. And at the very outset of that journey, here in the wilderness, the devil is attempting to convince Jesus to steer away from the course that God has planned for him. This undeserved suffering and death, to find another way to sidetrack him. And it's when he was alone in the desert, the Judean desert, which is between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea. In November, we're going to be there. We're going to be in that desert. Come, if you want to. But we also find times, don't we, when we are alone, when we're wandering about, we're surrounded by dangerous temptations, threatened. You know, Peter reminds us in 1 Peter 5, the enemy is like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. And for us, he wants to lure us, like Jesus, off of the course that God has set for us. He wants to stop us from accomplishing the call of God on our lives. And he does it very subtly, and he does it very easily. So what can we learn from the wilderness experience of Jesus? And how can we compare it with what was happening to those children of Israel in the Old Testament? And what it will do, it will make us look again at the dark areas of our own life, you know. Where are the places in our life when we are losing the battle? You know, the habits and the procrastinations in our lives, you're putting things off all the time, the anxiety that bubbles up to the top, conflicts and faithlessness and sleepiness, laziness. The first thing that we can learn in the Jesus' temptations in the wilderness is something about identity. If you noticed, central to all of Jesus' temptations was his identity. The repeated statement of the devil was this: if you are the Son of God. But we know, don't we, that God had just spoken just 40 days previously at the River Jordan. The heavens had opened, the dove had fallen, and the voice had boomed out saying, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." But here in the wilderness, there was no confirmation of that. There was no voice from heaven coming, confirming that to him. God was silent. But Jesus believed that word from God, and he held fast to it when Satan was saying to him, "If you are the Son of God." Jesus knew who he was right through that wilderness experience. And for us, in the wilderness, we do not let the enemy make us question our identity in God. We know that God loves us. We know that God died for us. We know that we're made in his image. And you know what? It's amazing to me that even when Jesus was hanging on a cross, the devil was still roaring relentlessly about his identity. The crowd were crying, "If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." He was still at it. He will always try to come and, particularly at weak times, doubt the love and the care of God for us and whether he's working out his purposes in our lives. But we remember we are children of the King, even when we're in the midst of a wilderness experience. When we face temptation, we can be victorious over the adversary's attempt to usurp and corrupt the Lord's rightful place in our lives. We can, because we belong to him. And we say again with conviction, "I am my beloved's and he is mine." I know my identity. Secondly, the nature of the temptation. It's not a sin to be tempted. It is a sin to yield to it. And we do need to distinguish, I think, between temptation and trial. Trials are from God, and they are there to strengthen our faith. Temptation is enemy-induced, and it is intended to completely destroy our relationship with God, our faith, and also to distract us away from God. Rob often gives a really helpful illustration of temptation and trial, and you've probably heard it. He takes the boxing analogy, and he says, you've got the sparring partner and you've got the opponent. The sparring partner there is like the trial, and he's there and he's bopping away at you, and it's there to strengthen you. It's there to give you experience, it's there to help you and to give you, things that you need for this fight. And you know that he's there to help you. But you get into the ring with that opponent. He's not there to help you. All he wants to do is to bop you and deck you. And that's the end of it. There's no Mr. Nice Guy. It's to knock you out, isn't it? And that's the difference between trial and temptation. For Christ, the temptations for him were not to see whether Christ would sin, but it was for God to prove that he wouldn't. There was an illustration about a bridge that was built in the Union Pacific Railroad, and it was being constructed, and it had this very elaborate trestle bridge across a large canyon, and they wanted to test this bridge. And so the builder loaded a train with extra cars and lots of stuff, really packed up this train to the full. And the train was then driven to the middle of this bridge. And it stayed there for an entire day. And one worker asked the engineer, he said, "Are you trying to break that bridge?" And the engineer replied, "No," he said, "I'm trying to prove that that bridge will not break." Difference, isn't it? I love Hebrews 4:15 that tells us we do not have a high priest, Jesus, who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, and yet without sin. So what are the temptations then that we read about, and what do they tell us? There's three temptations for three needs in this wilderness. And the first one was material, physical. It was for Jesus to distrust the care of his Father for him and to instead serve the needs of his own flesh, without God. The second one was a mental one. It was all about presumption. And it was for Jesus to put pressure on the Father by putting God to the test. And the third one was spiritual. It was for Jesus to renounce all the ways of his Father and to bow down and to worship the devil. Idolatry. Material and physical temptation. If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread, said the enemy. And you notice how he comes at the point of weakness. Jesus has been fasting for 40 days. Of course, he's starving. Of course, he's hungry. And when we are vulnerable, the enemy looks for the weakness in us and goes after it. That's his strategy. It's as if the enemy was saying to Jesus, is God ever going to come through for you? Can you trust him? You can't wait any longer for him. And the devil often finds legitimate needs to tempt us to meet that need in our own way. We know, don't we, right back in Genesis with Abraham, how he stepped ahead of God. And he took Sarah's handmaid in order to procure a son. And we are still living today with the consequences of that. He went ahead of God. And Jesus replied to the devil in the wilderness, man shall not live by bread alone, but by God's word. He said in another place, didn't he? My meat and my drink is to do the will of him who sent me. And so our priority is God first and material needs second. Jesus said, if you seek God's kingdom first, all these other things will be added unto you. Also, I think the devil's challenge was for Jesus to prove that he was, in fact, God's son. He says, if you turn these rocks into bread, people will follow you like the clappers. He said, they love a few tricks here and there. That is going to really appeal to the people. But Jesus knew that it wasn't his time for that. Jesus knew that there was going to come a time when he was going to turn water into wine and when he was going to feed 5,000 hungry people with 2 fishes and 5 loaves. But not now. He was not going to turn stones into bread. Interestingly enough, when we go back to the wilderness experience of the children of Israel, it was hunger that was a big thing for them. But we notice the difference with the children of Israel there. The effect on the wilderness for them was not like Jesus. It was complete negativity. And it's true, isn't it, that when we're in that dry place, when we are in that barren place spiritually, hard place, it has all kinds of negative effects on us. For them, it was a problem of food. And God amazingly provided for them manna and quail. But they complained. They hated that light food. And in Exodus 16 in the Message, it says, the whole company complained there in the wilderness. Why didn't God let us die in comfort in Egypt, where we had lamb stew and all the bread we could eat? Did you bring us to the wilderness to starve us to death? They were governed by material and practical things, which caused them to moan and grumble and to criticize, rather than remembering the amazing blessings, the amazing deliverance that God had brought them. His unfailing goodness for them. This wilderness experience for the children of Israel was a huge learning curve. And they had to go through it before they could ever go into the promised land. It says in Deuteronomy 1 that God never intended them to spend 40 years in the desert. It was because of their disobedience. They could have been there for weeks, I think. 40 years. Deuteronomy 8:3, it says, he humbled you, causing you to hunger and then feeding you, to teach you that man does not live by bread alone, but every word from God's mouth. It was understanding what was the most important thing in life. And that is why Jesus quoted it in his answer to the devil in the wilderness. The second one was mental temptation, presumption. In the second temptation, the devil takes Jesus to the highest point of the temple, and he says, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, God will save you. It says so in the Word. He's quoting from Psalm 91. And John MacArthur, in his commentary, says, the devil takes a beautiful verse about trusting God and twists it into an invitation to test God. It's as if the devil is responding to Jesus' first temptation. So you trust God, you're not going to turn the stones into bread, you're trusting God. Well, let's see how much you trust him. And he's urging Jesus to be presumptuous. He was getting Jesus to prove the reality of God's love and care for him. He was urging him to focus on himself and not God. God will save you if you chuck yourself off of the temple. Okay, Jesus, he said, you're not turning stones to bread, you're trusting God. Well, make a public demonstration of it so people can see and they can trust God and see his protection. And sometimes, we do that. We demand from God a visible proof of his love and his care. We say, don't we? If you don't heal me, I'm afraid I can't believe in you. We say, give me that job, or else I won't follow you. They say, make that girl like me, or I'm going to just go the other way. That's not faith. That's putting God to the test. And that's what exactly Jesus' reply was. It's written, quoting from Deuteronomy 6, don't put your God to the test. How dare we put God to the test? The other thing there is that the devil could have been tempting Jesus to be a miracle-working Messiah instead of a suffering servant. And Jesus' reply showed that he rejected any way except the path of faith and obedience, which was ultimately going to lead him to a cross. And he set his face like a flint towards Jerusalem. Another thing about the second temptation, it would have been very dramatic, wouldn't it, if Jesus had thrown himself off the temple? Oh, people would have seen that, wouldn't they? It would have been in the Jerusalem Post that night for sure. And let us be very, very careful that we are not tempted to make, our gifts and our ministries about how good we look, how dramatic it is, instead of it's God's work and it's how good God looks. Sensationalism appeals to the flesh. Jesus wants hearts. Jesus took on the form of a servant. He certainly wasn't a popular celebrity. And neither should we be, or attempt to be. So, the second temptation of presumption. Jesus reacts in sharp contrast to the way that the children of Israel reacted to this one. Their lack of faith, even despite the signs and wonders that God has constantly displayed to them, caused God to have to discipline them. They remember in Exodus 17 where they're complaining against Moses and God because there was no water. They said, is the Lord among us or not? If he is, then let him prove it by giving us water. Do you see what they're doing? They're putting God to the test. The third one, spiritual temptation. This is idolatry. The devil took Jesus to a very high mountain and he showed him all the kingdoms of the world. And he said, all this I will give you if you bow down and worship me. Do you know the crazy thing about that was? That God had already offered it to Jesus. It tells us in Psalm 2 and 8, God says to the Son, ask of me and I will give you the nations for your inheritance and the uttermost parts of the earth for your possession. God had already given the promise to Jesus that was going to be his anyway. But what Satan was trying to do, he was trying to, accelerate it. He didn't want these kingdoms to come, through a cross and through shame and through suffering. The way of obedience would be hard and long and difficult. So he said to him, why not make a deal with me? Why not compromise to obtain the desired effect immediately? All it would take was to bow down the knee to Satan and collude against God. We can't allow him in. I heard a horrendous true story about a family in Florida. And they bought this little Burmese python as a pet. I can't imagine how anybody would want a snake for a pet, but still, never mind. And it was a sweet little thing, and they put it in this glass aquarium. But after a few months, this thing grew and grew and grew until it was 12 feet long. And one night, with all its strength, it smashed its way out of that glass aquarium. It slithered into the bedroom of their 2-year-old daughter, wrapped itself around her and strangled her. Satan wants us to open the door and let him come into our house. Let me tell you, he is not a sweet little Burmese python. He's a dangerous python. We can't control him without the power of the Holy Spirit. We can't restrain him. We can't keep him in a glass aquarium. So don't let him in. He's not a pet. What Satan is doing, he's suggesting that we can get whatever our heart desires. Why do we keep the bar so high in our lives? We can cut a corner here or shade a bit of truth there. And we do exactly what the enemy was tempting Jesus to do. Put himself first. Put ourselves first. But Jesus' reply was crystal clear. You just admire Jesus, don't you? He says, get out of here. You worship the Lord your God and serve him only. There's no compromise. It's God first, always. There's no idolatry. Idolatry is such a destructive thing. Worshipping people and things and positions, and relegating God to the margins of our life. It's so foolish. I can remember when I was 18 years of age. That's a long time ago, actually. And I was doing my nursing training in Cardiff. And we were in the preliminary training school, and we were having lectures on public health. And as part of our public health lectures, a whole group of us were taken to the brand new Olympic-sized swimming baths at Cardiff to learn about how all they worked, And we were stood there on the edge of this pool, this big group of student nurses. We were stood there on the edge of the pool. And the guy was muttering on about chlorination and all of this. Do you know, I didn't hear a word that he said. Because on the other side of the pool, I noticed an Adonis. He was a lifeguard and gorgeous beyond words. So they finished this lecture and everything, and I thought to myself, as it finished, I thought, well, that's a module that I failed. I never heard a word he said. But we went then into the foyer in order to have a transport to take us back to the hospital. And to my utter shock, this lifeguard came up to me and he said, would you like to go out on a date? I said, yes. And my heart was going inside, would I ever? And I accepted his invitation. And I was very, very delighted. I was a strong Christian at the time. Do you know, never once did it come into my head, do I need to consult God about this? I just went for this guy. And we went out for, months, several months. It was lovely. But do you know what? It was so subtle, it was so gradual, but all the time, the relationship that I had with God, a lovely relationship with God, was getting fuzzier and fuzzier and fuzzier. And all my attention was on this guy. Until one day, a colleague in the hospital came up to me and she said, Pam, she said, I've been sitting on this for months. She said, but I've got to tell you. She said, that guy that you're dating, she said, is already in a long-term relationship. And he has said to his girlfriend that he's going to break the relationship. And she is absolutely heartbroken. She's in pieces. And you know, it was like a pump in my chest. I thought, I've got to go to God. So I went to God and I said, God, what do I do? And it's almost like the word in my head says, you know very well what you've got to do. This is idolatry. This is idolatry. You have put a person before me. And so I did. I finished that relationship and I said to him, I'm very, very sad that you were so, you so deceived me. But it was so painful. It was so painful. But you know what? 3 months later, I met another Adonis. And you can tell me what his name was. Yes, Roberto Scott Cook. I rest my case. But you see the point of that story? What Jesus is saying to the devil, you have no place here. You will not take first place in my life. I will not bow down to you. I will not have idolatry of this nature in my life. I belong to God, and I will worship him, and I will live for him first, and he will give me all these other things. For the children of Israel, they failed this test big time. Because you may remember that Moses had gone up to Sinai. And there on Sinai, he had been in the presence of God for 40 days and 40 nights. And God had spoken to him. God had given him words of life, a blueprint for the way that the people were going to live, the 10 Commandments. And he came down from the mountain, and he had been so much in the presence of God that he had to put a veil over his face because the glory was shining out of him. And he came down the mountain, and you'd have thought, wouldn't you, that the people of God were expectantly waiting at the foot of the mountain. Oh, here he comes. He's got the words from God for us. Marvelous. Were they? They were cavorting around a golden calf that they had made. Abandoned in their idolatry. Completely distracted. And so much so that in utter disappointment and horror, Moses smashes the tablets of the law. I read a Jewish folk tale recently, which makes the point very well. I think if Robin Williamson was here, he could tell this folk tale much better than me. But it was about a king who had a beautiful daughter. It's always about a king with a beautiful princess, isn't it? Somebody wants to marry her, isn't it? It's always about that. But she had many offers of marriage, and she was a romantic girl, and she wanted a man that was going to absolutely, love her first and foremost before everything else. And so she devised a way that she would test all the suitors that came. She made an announcement that went through all the kingdom, that on a certain day there was going to be a race. A bit like Love Running, I think, And the winner would marry the princess. And there was paupers and princes there. There was every type of person you could imagine. They were all lining up for this race. And off they set, and the goal was the princess at the end. But the king felt a bit sorry for them. And so he thought, right, on the way, I'm going to put down on the side of the road trinkets and bags of gold, because he was a very wealthy man. And he put down all these things, along the road, so that people, as they're running along, could just dart off and pick up things that were appealing to their eyes. And so off they went. And they were running along, in a bag of gold here, there, and a lovely pendant there, and they put them all in their pockets, and they ran and ran and ran. But there was one man, and he didn't stop for any of that bling and trinket. His goal was he was going to run for his bride. He was going to run for the princess. He loved her, and he was going to show her he loved her. And he ran all the way. And, he won his prize. He won his prize. Don't let us be distracted with the things that will never be like God. They will never satisfy and give us, the things that God gives us. Don't let us be distracted by all those things. Let us say tonight, let us say, I am going to clear them out of my life. I'm not going to live in idolatry. I am not going to bow down and worship the devil. Hebrews 3:7 in the Message says, don't harden your hearts as in the bitter uprising, that time of wilderness testing. Even though they watched me at work for 40 years, your ancestors refused to let me do it my way. Over and over they tried my patience, and I was provoked, and I said they'll never keep their minds on God. They refuse to walk down my road. Don't let God have to say that about us. For Jesus, he came out of the wilderness victorious, and he started off on this ministry that did lead to a cross, but the ministry that brought us all into life. And the children of Israel, although a whole generation died in the wilderness, they did also go into the promised land and gain their inheritance. We can learn so much in the wilderness. God doesn't want us to pitch camp there. He wants us to come out of the wilderness. He wants us to be transformed by it. And he wants us to enter into all the hope and the blessing that he intends for every single one of us. Someone said this, and I'm going to close with this. The more you love Jesus, the less appeal the temptations of the enemy will have. When a hawk is attacked by crows, it doesn't make a counterattack, but it soars higher and higher in ever-widening circles until its tormentor leaves him alone. May we know that sort of experience with God.